I knew something was wrong. The night the steel beneath my boots felt like it was breathing, rising and falling in slow waves, as if the entire rig were perched on the back of something alive. They warned me during orientation that working in the Mariana Trench meant living by 11 strict rules, each one stranger than the last, but I didn't understand how serious they were until I broke one without realizing it. I still remember the moment my mistake made the lights dim and the vibrations change pitch, almost like a warning whispered through metal. I wish I could forget what happened next, but the trench doesn't let go easily. I learned Rule 1. Never investigate the midnight vibrations alone on my third night stationed at the Mariana Trench rig, long before I understood why everyone whispered it under their breath, like a warning not meant to be spoken too loudly. The rule was pinned on the steel board outside the generator bay, but no one bothered explaining what counted as midnight vibrations, so I assumed it was just another safety precaution. That confidence lasted until I felt the platform shift beneath my boots in a way that didn't feel like machinery or pressure from the deep. It felt like movement, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like something massive brushing the underside of the rig. The shift was subtle at first, a gentle hum traveling through the railings as I made my rounds along the main walkway. I paused near the valve station, waiting for the vibration to fade, but instead it grew steadier, forming a pulse that throbbed under the metal. It didn't match any generator cycle I knew, and I'd memorized them all during training. The air grew heavier with each pulse, thick enough that I could feel the vibrations inside my ribs, as though the structure and I were sharing a heartbeat. I considered waking Torres, the night supervisor, but he hated being disturbed unless something was actively on fire. My pride got the better of me, and I convinced myself that I could check the panel readings alone, even if the rules suggested otherwise. The walkway lights flickered as I approached the central junction, dimming in a synchronized rhythm that matched the vibrations. For a moment I wondered if the entire rig was echoing some distant signal coming from below, answering something I couldn't hear. When I reached the monitoring console, the screen glowed with shifting lines that bent and curled as if responding to the tremors. I tapped the display, assuming it was glitching from the constant pressure in the trench, but the lines continued moving the same way, weaving into a pattern almost like a repeating signal. The generator outputs weren't spiking, and there were no temperature warnings, yet the structure beneath me kept pulsing as though breathing underneath the steel. I tried to focus on data, but the readings didn't match anything I'd ever seen on a deep water rig. A faint warmth spread through the floor plates under my boots, startling me enough to step back from the console. The trench water outside never rose above freezing, so the warmth felt completely unnatural, like something alive had brushed against the support columns. I steadied myself and leaned over the edge of the walkway to look down, but the darkness below swallowed the dim lamp glow before it reached the first platform level. The pulsing grew stronger, traveling from the bolts in the floor up through the railing and into my hands. Against my better judgment, I followed the rhythm toward the eastern maintenance ladder, where the vibrations felt strongest. The lamps overhead flickered again as I approached, but this time the dimming felt intentional, almost guiding. I gripped the ladder tightly and placed one boot on the first rung. The metal felt warmer than before, warm enough that I pulled my hand back instinctively. A cold shiver ran through me despite the heat, and for the first time I wondered if the rule wasn't about the danger above the rig, but something below it. I forced myself to descend anyway, each rung vibrating under my gloves with a steady, heavy pulse. It reminded me of resting a hand on the side of a massive engine, except the rhythm didn't feel mechanical. It felt organic, like the heartbeat of something far too large to exist under a man-made platform. The deeper I went, the darker the air seemed to feel, as if the shadows thickened with each step. The only sounds came from the shifting metal and the faint hiss of the oxygen vents releasing bursts of stale air. When I reached the lowest maintenance platform, the vibrations were so strong the railing trembled visibly. I placed a cautious hand on the steel beam and felt movement far below, something sliding across the trench wall, slow and heavy. The rig swayed gently from the contact, not violently, but as if nudged. The sensation tightened every muscle in my back. I had never felt the Mariana Trench behave like this, and no one had ever mentioned anything that could move enough water at this depth to nudge a structure built to withstand pressure that crushed submarines. I swept my flashlight across the steel lattice, looking for any visible damage or stress fractures. The beam of light cut through drifting mist that shouldn't have been present in an airtight maintenance bay. My breath echoed inside my mask, louder than usual, as the mist swirled toward the edge of the platform, like it was being drawn by something. The vibration suddenly paused for a few seconds, leaving a suffocating silence hovering in the air. I didn't realize how much comfort the rhythm had given me until it stopped. The silence felt wrong, heavy, watchful, as if the entire rig were holding its breath along with me. I stepped back carefully, feeling my boots tap against the grated floor as I reached for the ladder again. Before I could climb, the vibration returned stronger than before, shooting upward with such force that I gripped the railing to keep from falling. The pulse rolled through the entire structure, then repeated, steadier, deeper, more deliberate. It felt like a call, one that the rig responded to with a low groan stretching through the beams. I forced myself to move, climbing each rung carefully as the pulses continued beneath me. The ladder shook with each wave, making the descent feel twice as long even though I was climbing up. A faint light flickered at the top of the shaft, bent slightly as if warped by water, though no water was present. My breath quickened when I heard a distant shifting below me, something heavy sliding back against the trench rock. It echoed upward, like the slow drag of granite against steel. When I reached the top platform, the light stabilized, but the air felt changed, denser, as if carrying the residue of something that had brushed past the rig. I stepped into the corridor, wiping my gloves on my jumpsuit as though I could shake off the tension. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't have come down alone. I walked back toward the generator bay, trying to shake the feeling that something beneath the rig had followed my movement in the dark, tracking me through vibrations in the steel. The corridor felt narrower than before, the shadows stretching longer under the weak glow of the lamps. I kept one hand on the railing, counting each pulse through the metal as though timing them might help me understand what was happening. When I turned the corner toward the generator room, the door was already half open, though I distinctly remembered closing it when I left. The panel lights inside glowed an unnatural shade of blue, pulsing faintly in the same rhythm I had felt below. I took one cautious step inside and froze. The gauges on the main console were moving on their own, shifting between readings that made no sense, pressure spikes that shouldn't exist, temperature dips that contradicted every known condition this deep, and a repeating signal pattern on the main display. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it matched the rhythm still humming under the floor. I approached slowly, heart thudding with the same uneasy pace. As I leaned toward the screen, all the gauges stilled at once, as though something recognized my presence. The vibration stopped completely. The air thickened. For a moment I felt weightless, suspended between the last pulse and whatever would follow, but nothing happened. The rig stood in perfect stillness, silent except for my breathing echoing inside the room. Then the generator lights snapped to red, one by one, bathing the bay in a dim glow that made every shadow stretch long across the steel. I opened my mouth to call for Taurus, but the moment I turned toward the door, the vibration returned. A single heavy pulse that rolled through the floor and up my spine, like a cold hand pressing against me. It wasn't random this time. It felt like a response, a warning, or something answering the mistake of coming here alone. And then from somewhere deep beneath the rig, something moved again, slow, massive, deliberate, making the steel under me tremble in a way that felt almost like recognition. The first thing I noticed, stepping into the dim corridor after the unsettling events below, was how easy it was to forget the second rule. Always keep the emergency lights on when vibrations start. I had been so focused on climbing back and checking the main console that I didn't even consider that the lights, which were supposed to guide me, could be my only safeguard against what lurked beneath. I flicked the small switch beside the doorway and watched the emergency panel flare to life, bathing the corridor in a pale, steady glow. It wasn't bright enough to feel safe, but it cut through the oppressive shadows and gave me some measure of direction. As I moved toward the generator bay, I realized the corridor seemed longer than before, stretching like a tunnel in the deep ocean. Every step made a soft metallic echo that bounced back from the walls, competing with the faint, rolling vibrations still thrumming beneath the rig. I kept my eyes fixed on the light panels above, calculating their intervals, watching for any irregular flicker. The emergency lights gave a pattern to follow, a pulse that countered the unnatural rhythm coming from below. Without them, I would have had no reference at all, just an endless black void pressing in from all sides. I stopped at the junction near the oxygen control panel, where the floor plates still hummed faintly from the last tremors. My heart raced as I remembered the shift that had almost thrown me from the ladder earlier. The emergency lights cast long, narrow shadows along the pipes and grates, and for a moment, it felt like something was sliding just outside their reach. I held my flashlight in one hand and the gauge in the other, letting the pale glow of the lights guide my movements, a lifeline through the uncertain darkness. Every flicker of the panel reminded me why the rule existed, though I still didn't understand the depth of its purpose. Torres's words came back to me: never ignore the lights when the vibrations start. At the time, I'd brushed it off as precautionary, but the scene around me proved otherwise. I thought about the logs showing minor tremors and how the rig responded differently when the vibrations weren't random. The lights weren't just illumination, they were a kind of communication, a rhythm we were meant to follow. My pulse synced with the emergency glow, and I tried to let it guide me toward the main bay without getting lost in the endless metallic corridors. As I moved, the shadows seemed to stretch and contract unnaturally, giving the impression that the walls were breathing. I focused on the steady glow above, refusing to let my eyes wander into the black corners, where I imagined the floor trembling with something alive beneath the steel. Each flicker in the emergency lighting felt like a warning, like the rig itself was urging me to move cautiously. I held my flashlight at a low angle, scanning every pipe and valve for movement, while letting the lights establish a safe path. The vibration increased again, not violently, but in a rolling, deliberate pulse that shook the handrails lightly under my touch. The emergency lights responded almost immediately, flickering in sequence with each tremor. I noticed how the pattern changed subtly with every thrum, as if the lights were reacting to the presence of something moving below. I had a brief, disorienting thought that maybe the rule wasn't about safety at all. It was about noticing, reading, and interpreting signals I wasn't meant to understand. My stomach tightened at the idea. I climbed the final set of grates leading to the main generator bay, holding on to the rail with one hand and checking the emergency lights with the other. The corridor opened into a larger platform, and the lights illuminated the steel beams that had been swaying subtly with the last tremors. The vibrations were stronger now, echoing beneath the floor plates in a steady thumping rhythm. I realized that without the glow of the emergency lights, I wouldn't have noticed the micro movements in the metal supporting the rig. Those tiny shifts told a story of something enormous moving just beyond reach. Inside the generator bay, I paused to check the main control panel, my flashlight bouncing across the gauges while the emergency lights continued their pale, steady vigil. Each meter was normal, yet the vibrations beneath the floor persisted, subtle and deliberate, almost communicative. I traced my steps along the glowing corridor lines and tried to anticipate the next tremor. Every vibration seemed coordinated, as if testing my reactions, and I felt an unshakable sense that ignoring the lights would be the same as ignoring a direct warning. I considered turning off my flashlight to conserve energy, but I remembered the rule and kept both sources active, letting the emergency lights anchor me in space. The vibration became more pronounced, and I noticed the shadows stretching farther along the metal floor, moving independently of my flashlight's beam. It was subtle but unmistakable. Something down there was aware of my presence, responding to my movements. I felt a chill run through me as I realized that the lights weren't just guiding me, they were marking the only path where the rig remained safe. The corridor forked near the secondary control room, and the vibrations thumped harder in a sequence that seemed almost impatient. I hesitated at the split, feeling the structure sway gently as though nudged from below. I followed the emergency lights instinctively, knowing they marked the correct path. Shadows twisted in ways that didn't obey logic, shapes that seemed to slide just out of view while the steady glow reassured me. I wasn't completely lost. The rhythm of the lights became a kind of heartbeat, synchronizing with the vibrations beneath the rig in a way that felt like a warning. At the control room entrance, I paused to assess the gauges and panels. The emergency lights highlighted a faint shimmer along the floor, an anomaly that wasn't present before. I stepped closer, keeping the lights between me and whatever lurked below. The pulsing vibrations increased subtly, resonating through the steel floor beneath my boots. My chest tightened as I realized how easily the rig could mislead anyone who ignored the emergency lights. Every flicker now felt purposeful, not random, and I understood that following the glow was critical for survival. The control panels offered readings that contradicted everything I had ever learned about deep water rigs, and the vibrations' rhythm continued to escalate, though the emergency lights provided a sense of timing and location. I traced the flow along the platform, noticing how shadows stretched unnaturally along the structural beams, almost like something beneath the rig was mapping my path. Each pulse of the vibration seemed to synchronize with the light, a pattern impossible to ignore. My hands gripped the rail tighter, and I whispered to myself, reminding that rule, though it was already burned into memory. For the next hour, I followed the corridor, using the emergency lights as a guide, while the vibrations communicated something indecipherable beneath the rig. The rhythm changed subtly with every step, and shadows danced in ways that didn't correspond to the lamps. I kept my breathing steady, but my senses were heightened to the extreme. Every pulse of metal beneath my feet, a reminder of how fragile our presence was here. I realized fully now that always keeping the emergency lights on when vibrations start wasn't merely precaution, it was an anchor to reality, the only tool preventing something below from disorienting me entirely. As I neared the generator core, the vibrations intensified to a low rolling pulse almost musical in its repetition. The emergency lights illuminated a path across the steel grates that made the shadows stretch into long slithering shapes. I tried not to look down, but the glow made every movement visible, and I understood that without it I would be navigating blindly through a rig alive with unseen energy. I stepped carefully, matching each tremor with the light pattern, realizing that the rig itself seemed to be alive, responding to my adherence to the rule. The core room came into view, and the vibration beneath my boots escalated again, rolling in waves that shook my spine with every step. The emergency lights outlined the steel beams, pulsing slightly with each tremor, as though signaling safe footholds. I followed the path, careful to step where the glow indicated solid support, and my flashlight traced the shadows that still shifted unnaturally. I understood then that the rule wasn't optional, it was survival. Ignoring it meant letting the trench beneath dictate my movements, and I had no intention of letting that happen. Even after the terrifying lesson of the emergency lights, I still almost forgot Rule 3. Never follow sounds coming from below the rig. When I heard that faint, wet scraping echo in the maintenance shaft, it started as a low, distant murmur that blended with the vibrations, like metal brushing against metal somewhere deep beneath us. My first instinct was to investigate, to find the source and prove to myself that it was mechanical or perhaps debris shifting in the trench currents. But the closer I listened, the more deliberate the sound became, as if something alive was testing the rigidity of the structure above it. I realized immediately how easily a mistake here could spiral into disaster. I stepped cautiously along the graded walkway, my flashlight cutting swaths of light into the dark corners, while the emergency lights hummed softly behind me. Each beam caught the edges of shadowed beams and pipes, revealing nothing that belonged. The sound persisted, a wet scraping that moved rhythmically with the vibrations under my boots. I could feel the pulse of the rig in tandem with it, and instinctively I knew that following it would break every instinct the rules had drilled into me. But curiosity was a heavy weight, pressing down in a way that made my steps hesitant and uncertain. Tor's warnings echoed in my mind. He had said once, "Some things beneath the rig shouldn't be acknowledged. They exist in patterns we aren't meant to trace." The scraping wasn't like any machinery I had ever worked with. It slithered between frequencies, a sound that seemed to stretch the steel itself. The noise grew louder, harmonizing with the faint pulse from the last tremors, creating an unnatural rhythm that drew my attention. I stopped mid-step, gripping the railing with sweaty palms, trying to decide whether my rational mind or the instinct for survival would win. As I froze, the shadows at the edges of my flashlight seemed to twist unnaturally, bending around corners that should have been straight. The scraping shifted in pitch, rising and falling like it was aware of my hesitation. My heart rate accelerated, and I realized I had begun inching toward the source without even consciously deciding to. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was breaking Rule 3. Never follow sounds coming from below the rig, and that instinct was right. I paused and drew a deep breath, attempting to summon rational explanations for what I was hearing. I forced myself to step backward, letting the glow of the emergency lights keep me oriented. The corridor suddenly felt narrower, the shadows more aggressive, and the scraping became a deliberate, sliding drag that echoed through the metal beams. It wasn't mechanical, and no tools or equipment could produce a sound like this at such depth. I hugged the wall, trying to resist the compulsion to track the noise, aware that giving in could mean the difference between returning to my bunk and disappearing into the depths. Despite the warnings, my curiosity flickered like a weak flame. I had to convince myself logically there was nothing down there that a human could interact with. Yet each vibration, each pulse in the floor plates, seemed timed to draw me closer. The rig felt alive, subtly shifting its structure to guide or mislead my steps. I thought about the rule and how it was designed to prevent this exact scenario. One wrong move toward the unknown, and the trench would claim more than just my fear. I forced myself to keep my gaze on the fixed lights, resisting the pull of the scraping. The sound became more structured, like dragging chains, moving across beams that I knew were solid and untouched by machinery. The pulse beneath me echoed it, creating a dual rhythm that pressed against my skull. I gripped the flashlight tighter, willing myself to obey the rule, though the shadowed corners made every step an exercise in restraint. I could almost feel the presence of something massive, waiting just beyond the light's reach, observing my every hesitation. It was as if following the sound was a test of obedience to the rules I had only partially understood. I moved cautiously toward the junction near the secondary ladder, forcing each footstep to stay within the glow of the emergency lights. The scraping dragged across unseen metal, a deliberate and chilling pattern that seemed aware of my positioning. My breathing grew shallow as I considered the consequences of turning my back on it, knowing that the rule existed because someone, somewhere had learned too late. The vibrations underneath were now stronger, almost synchronized with the scraping, and I realized that whatever made the noise was not just below, it was tracking me, calculating my responses to the steel beneath. Reaching the base of the secondary ladder, I paused, evaluating whether my next steps could be guided solely by the lights, without even glancing downward. The corridor opened slightly, revealing the faint shadows of equipment racks and piping, but no source of the sound. The scraping persisted, shifting subtly along the floor plates, tracing a path that I refused to follow. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a maintenance cable rubbing somewhere deep, but the rhythm and intent behind the sound denied any explanation that didn't involve something living, deliberate, and aware. I backed away slowly, inching toward the intersection that led back to the main generator bay. Each step resonated with the low, rolling vibration beneath my boots, which now seemed almost in dialogue with the scraping. I kept my focus on the glow of the emergency lights, recalling again why Rule 3, never follow sounds coming from below the rig, existed. If I ignored it, I knew the consequences wouldn't be just fear, they would be permanent. The corridor seemed endless, stretching forward, and every flicker of shadow hinted at movement just beyond perception. As I returned to the main platform, the scraping shifted abruptly, moving faster along the lower beams, like it had noticed my retreat. My pulse quickened, echoing the vibrations that now rolled in stronger waves. I held my flashlight forward, casting a cone of light over the steel lattice, and kept my steps within the steady glow of the emergency panels. My body tensed with the realization that following the noise, even once, could have been fatal, and I understood that the rule was as much about restraint as awareness. I fought the urge to look down again, every instinct screaming that curiosity was dangerous here. I paused near the main junction, letting the vibrations stabilize slightly while the scraping faded into a slower, intermittent drag. I could still feel it beneath the floor, somewhere just beyond reach, but I ignored it. I remembered how previous crew members had whispered of shapes glimpsed out of the corner of their eyes, of metal bending slightly around unseen forces, and I realized that the rule was meant to keep all of us grounded, both literally and mentally. My legs shook from tension, but I stayed within the emergency light glow, aware that stepping outside it could be a mistake. As the corridor straightened toward the generator bay, I noticed the shadows recede slightly, yet the vibrations continued. I forced my breathing into a steady rhythm, matching the pulse beneath me, and let the lights dictate my path. The scraping became intermittent, teasing, almost playful in its unpredictability, but I refused to follow. Every instinct told me that obeying the rule was the only way to survive, and the Mariana Trench had already proven it didn't forgive mistakes. I pushed onward, every step measured and cautious, knowing the lesson of this sound would stay with me forever. By the time I reached the main bay, the scraping had disappeared completely, but the memory lingered as a cold, pressing weight at the base of my skull. I double-checked the emergency lights and the generator outputs, noting that the pulses beneath the floor were gradually subsiding. My muscles relaxed slightly, but the lesson was indelible. The second I considered ignoring Rule 3, never follow sounds coming from below the rig, I had felt the first real, tangible threat of the Mariana Trench in its purest, most deliberate form. The rig felt alive again, almost patient, as if it had acknowledged my obedience and allowed me to proceed. Even as I caught my breath in the main generator bay, I immediately remembered Rule 4, never ignore the warning lights on the outer platforms, which were installed precisely to prevent disaster when the rig reacted to the strange forces lurking below. The first time I had dismissed these blinking panels, I hadn't understood that the lights weren't just indicators. They were guides, safeguards, and subtle alarms all at once. Tonight, after feeling the scraping and vibrations, the warning lights seemed to pulse with urgency, almost as if the rig itself was insisting that I respect their message. I hesitated for only a moment before deciding to trace the lights along the graded walkways toward the observation deck. The outer platforms were a labyrinth of steel beams, ladders, and narrow corridors, all stretching into the oppressive darkness of the Mariana Trench. Each warning light blinked steadily, casting elongated shadows that danced in time with the low-frequency tremors beneath my boots. The contrast between the light and shadow made every movement feel amplified, as if the rig had become a predator tracking my progress. I kept my flashlight aligned with the glowing panels, using them as a spine to guide my steps, and tried to ignore the faint, irregular vibrations pulsing beneath the structure. As I stepped closer to the edge of the outer platform, the water beyond the railings seemed unnaturally dark, swallowing the dim glow from the rig and reflecting none of the light. The warning lights flashed intermittently along the beams, almost like Morse code, and I instinctively kept my eyes on the pattern. Ignoring them would have meant stepping blindly into danger. The vibrations grew more insistent here, shaking the steel floor plates in long rolling waves, yet the lights offered a path of clarity, anchoring me to a route that seemed almost impossible to navigate without them. A cold draft swept along the platform, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of the deep ocean and the tang of stale machinery. The rig groaned under the tremors, and I could hear distant clanks from support beams resonating in the darkness. Each warning light flickered as I passed, highlighting the edges of pipes, grates, and safety rails, making me hyper-aware of every detail. I noticed how small missteps on these platforms could mean a plunge into the abyss below, especially if one ignored the subtle cues given by the blinking lights. I paused to examine a junction near a secondary ladder leading down to a service deck, and the warning lights here blinked faster, almost urgently. The pulse from the vibrations underfoot seemed to synchronize with the blinking, creating a rhythm that was both hypnotic and alarming. My flashlight beam flicked across the platform edge, catching glimpses of shadows that didn't make sense. I tried to rationalize them as reflections, but my gut told me otherwise. I realized that the warning lights weren't merely for navigation, they were signaling something, an awareness embedded in the rig's design. As I advanced along the outer walkway, the tremors became more pronounced, rolling through the beams and grates in waves that made each step uncertain. The warning lights illuminated structural components I had previously overlooked. Stress points, bolts, and joints that flexed under pressure, all vibrating with a low rhythmic pulse. I noticed subtle movements in the shadows around the beams, almost like something massive shifted just below the platform. My every step was measured, guided by the glow, and I felt the tension between curiosity and survival grow stronger with each passing moment. The observation deck lay ahead, a section exposed directly to the abyss, with only the blinking warning lights marking safe footing. As I approached, I realized that the further I moved along the outer platforms, the more the rig seemed alive, responding to each step I took. The vibrations beneath my feet intensified, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, giving the impression of vast shapes moving in the water just beyond the railings. I held my flashlight tightly, allowing the blinking lights to guide me like a pulse that synchronized with the rhythm of the trench itself. Reaching the deck, I felt the full weight of the Mariana Trench pressing against the rig, its darkness enveloping everything beyond the edges of the platform. The warning lights flashed steadily, casting narrow beams that cut through the oppressive gloom. I noticed subtle shifts in the beams and grates beneath me, responding to the tremors that seemed almost deliberate. I kept my focus on the lights, refusing to look down into the abyss, knowing that one wrong step could have fatal consequences. The rule wasn't just precautionary, it was survival. I paused on the deck, listening to the low hum of the structure as the vibrations rolled through the steel. The warning lights blinked in a sequence that seemed almost conversational, guiding me safely across the exposed platforms. I realized that any hesitation or attempt to ignore the lights could have invited disaster, as the rig itself seemed to have mechanisms to punish mistakes. Shadows danced along the beams, but they never intruded into the path defined by the blinking panels. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that Rule 4, never ignore the warning lights on the outer platforms, existed, because the abyss below was alive with forces that could sense every step. A sudden shudder ran through the platform, and I gripped the railing as the lights flickered slightly in response. The vibration intensified, rolling like waves beneath the metal, and I understood that the rig wasn't just alerting me, it was communicating. Following the blinking lights became a delicate balancing act, keeping pace with the tremors while resisting the instinct to look into the shadows that pressed against the edges of my vision. Every step felt like a negotiation with something vast and incomprehensible beneath the steel structure. As I made my way to the next junction, I noticed a subtle distortion in the air, a shimmer that seemed to bend the light around the beams. The warning lights flared momentarily, accentuating the effect, and I realized how closely the rule tied observation to survival. Any lapse, any moment of doubt, and I might have wandered into a section where the vibrations could overwhelm the structure, or worse, awaken whatever moved silently in the depths. I kept my flashlight steady, using both its beam and the blinking lights as anchors, heart pounding with the knowledge that obedience to the rule was the only protection I had. By the time I returned toward the central platform, the vibrations had slowed, the intensity gradually diminishing, but never fully disappearing. The warning lights continued to blink along the beams, ensuring I remained on a path that was safe, or as safe as possible in the Mariana Trench. I paused for a moment to let the rhythm of the lights synchronize with my breathing, feeling the tension drain slightly from my shoulders. I realized fully why the rule existed, and why anyone ignoring it would be at grave risk. Following the lights wasn't just precaution, it was a lifeline, a tether to reality in a rig alive with forces beyond comprehension. I crossed the remaining outer platforms cautiously, every footstep deliberate, the vibrations beneath my boots steady but insistent. The warning lights blinked with quiet urgency, reminding me that one misstep could plunge me into the abyss below. Shadows twisted and stretched, but they never crossed the path illuminated by the lights, guiding me safely back toward the inner corridors. I felt a strange, almost reverent awareness of the rule now. Never ignore the warning lights on the outer platforms wasn't just about metal or engineering. It was about understanding the rhythm of the trench and respecting it. Finally, I reached the safety of the central platform, the steady hum of the generator filling the void that had been dominated by vibrations and shadows. The blinking warning lights remained as a reminder of the dangers I had narrowly avoided, and I understood that ignoring them would have meant venturing into forces far beyond my control. I let my hands rest on the railing, heart still pounding, knowing the rig had allowed me to return safely because I had obeyed. The lesson of Rule 4 was indelible. The abyss below was patient, and only the rules kept it from claiming careless humans. I had barely caught my breath after the ordeal on the outer platforms, when I remembered Rule 5, never touch or move objects that are out of place. A rule that seemed obvious, until I realized how easy it was to overlook things when the vibrations demanded my attention. On the Mariana Trench rig, even a loose bolt or a misaligned panel could be a trap, or worse, a signal. My flashlight flickered slightly as I scanned the grated walkway ahead, noticing a small metallic tool lying off to the side, just outside the emergency light's glow. Every instinct screamed to leave it alone, but curiosity tugged at me, reminding me how easy it was to make mistakes in these conditions. The tool's presence felt deliberate, almost staged, as if someone or something wanted me to notice it. I remembered Torres's warnings, his voice low in my mind. Things misplaced here aren't accidents. Never move them. I hesitated, feeling the vibration pulse stronger beneath my boots, echoing through the steel grates like a heartbeat. The tool shimmered faintly under my flashlight beam, creating shadows that danced unnaturally across the beams and walls. I forced myself to step around it, obeying the rule, but the uneasy feeling clung to me like a shadow, following every careful step I took toward the next junction. The corridor stretched before me, dark and narrow, with only the emergency lights and my flashlight marking the safe path. Every vibration rolled under my feet with deliberate force, testing my concentration. Shadows shifted in corners where no object should have been, creating the illusion of movement that wasn't there, or perhaps movement that was deliberately hidden. I focused on the path, aware that ignoring the rule even once could have consequences far worse than a simple misstep. The tool I passed remained on the side, innocuous yet menacing, a reminder of the Mariana Trench's hidden dangers. As I approached the main maintenance hatch, I noticed more objects slightly out of place: a coiled cable, a loose valve cover, and an empty crate that seemed too perfectly positioned. Each time, my instinctive reaction was to straighten, move, or adjust, but I stopped myself. I reminded myself that Rule 5, never touch or move objects that are out of place, existed for survival. The vibrations beneath the rig seemed to respond to my restraint, growing steadier when I followed the rule, yet shifting unpredictably when I lingered too long near the misplaced items. It was almost as if the trench itself was watching, testing my discipline. I paused near the corner of the service platform, considering the engineering schematics taped to a nearby panel. The schematics were out of place, slightly crumpled as if recently handled, and my mind battled the urge to straighten them. I gripped the railing tightly, reminding myself that this was exactly what the rule warned against. The vibrations pulsed beneath me, rising and falling with an eerie rhythm, and shadows along the beams stretched and curled in ways that defied logic. I focused on the path ahead, keeping my attention locked on the emergency lights and ignoring the small anomalies around me. Moving along the graded walkway, I passed a toolbox that had fallen from one of the higher platforms. Its contents were scattered slightly, creating a chaotic scene that tempted the practical side of me to organize it. But I froze, reminding myself again of the rule. The vibrations rolled steadily underfoot, almost like they were observing, waiting for me to make a move. The emergency lights reflected off metal surfaces, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach toward me, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening with each careful step. Ignoring Rule 5 here could have consequences beyond comprehension. A sudden low thrum echoed through the rig, stronger than before, as if the trench itself was responding to my restraint. I adjusted my flashlight beam, keeping it aligned with the safe path, and bypassed another misplaced object, a small valve wrench that glimmered faintly in the emergency light. The shadows stretched further along the beams, creating unnatural shapes that seemed to writhe in tandem with the vibrations. I realized fully that the Mariana Trench was teaching lessons in patience and obedience, and Rule 5 was one of the most critical. A single touch, a single movement, could trigger forces I was ill-prepared to face. As I approached the junction near the secondary generator hatch, the air grew colder, carrying with it the metallic scent of the trench water, mixed with something undefinable. The vibrations beneath the steel intensified, rolling in long deliberate waves that shook the railings gently. Shadows shifted subtly at the edges of my vision, highlighting objects that were out of place: a misaligned panel, a stray bolt, a loose pipe segment. I forced myself to step carefully, avoiding any interaction, understanding for the first time that the rule wasn't just about physical safety. It was about maintaining balance in a system I could barely comprehend. The corridor opened slightly into a wider platform, giving me a brief view of the surrounding rig. Loose cables and tools were scattered in minor disarray, seemingly mundane, yet my memory of previous warnings kept me from interfering. The vibrations rolled in patterns I couldn't predict, and every misstep near these items could have amplified the tremors or drawn attention from whatever lurked below. I let my flashlight sweep over each object, acknowledging its presence but refusing to act, feeling the weight of the Mariana Trench pressing in from all sides. Rule 5 was proving itself more than just a guideline, it was a lifeline. I rounded the corner toward the observation deck, noticing a crate slightly out of alignment on the edge of the walkway. The vibrations seemed to intensify as I approached, rolling like deliberate waves beneath the floor plates. I forced my steps to remain precise, letting the emergency lights guide me safely around the anomaly. The shadows cast by the crate stretched long across the grates, creating illusions of movement that my mind desperately tried to rationalize. Every fiber of my being screamed to correct the misalignment, but I obeyed the rule, feeling the pulse beneath me steady in response to my restraint. The observation deck itself was exposed to the abyss, and the deep darkness beyond the railings pressed in like a tangible weight. Objects out of place were scattered across the steel floor: a loose cable, a small toolbox, a stray wrench. I kept my distance from each, stepping carefully along the path illuminated by the emergency lights. The vibrations pulsed beneath me, rolling like deliberate waves, almost as if the trench was testing my obedience. I felt the full impact of Rule 5 here. Any deviation from its guidance could have consequences beyond my understanding, and the Mariana Trench would not forgive mistakes. As I slowly navigated the deck, my flashlight tracing the edges of each misplaced object, I realized the rule was less about tools or equipment, and more about respect for the rig and its environment. The vibrations rolled beneath the floor in deliberate, measured waves, and the shadows stretched unnaturally along the beams. Every object I ignored seemed to reinforce my safety. Every touch avoided reinforced my survival. I understood, in that moment, why Rule 5 was so critical. The trench itself noticed every infraction, and even the smallest movement could have consequences I wasn't ready to face. Finally, I reached the end of the outer platform, the steady glow of the emergency lights guiding me safely back toward the inner corridors. The vibrations beneath the floor began to subside, and the shadows slowly receded from the edges of my vision. Objects out of place remained where they were, undisturbed, yet their presence was a constant reminder of what could happen if the rules were ignored. I leaned against the railing, letting my heart rate slow, and felt a deep, unshakable respect for Rule 5. Never touch or move objects that are out of place. Disobedience here could have consequences far beyond the human mind. The moment I stepped away from the observation deck, I remembered Rule 6. Never leave a secured hatch open after checking it, and a cold dread ran down my spine as I recalled the last time someone had ignored it. Even a slight lapse could invite something unimaginable into the rig, and after everything that had happened with the vibrations and misplaced objects, I couldn't afford carelessness. The nearest hatch led to a maintenance crawl space, and I approached it slowly, hand hovering over the release latch. The steel was cold under my gloves, and the faint pulse of the vibrations beneath my boots reminded me that the trench was watching, measuring every action. I opened the hatch just enough to peer inside, my flashlight slicing through the darkness of the narrow space. The air smelled faintly metallic, mixed with the scent of compressed oil from the deep ocean. I reminded myself of Rule 6 as I leaned in slightly, checking for any displaced equipment or signs of movement below. The vibrations under the floor were subtle here, but persistent, rolling like a low heartbeat that synced with the faint echo of water moving far below the rig. I knew that leaving the hatch open, even for a second longer than necessary, could have consequences I wasn't ready to face. As I reached inside to examine the edges of the hatch, I noticed a slight misalignment in the support beam. It was minor, nothing that a proper adjustment couldn't fix, yet the rule reminded me not to tamper unnecessarily. I resisted the urge to fiddle with it, letting the hatch remain open only as long as I needed to inspect. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the crawl space, and the vibrations beneath my feet intensified, almost as if testing whether I would obey the rule. The tension in the air was suffocating, the trench pressing in invisibly around the rig. I closed the hatch carefully, ensuring it clicked into place and the locking mechanism engaged fully. Rule 6 flashed through my mind, warning me of the consequences of leaving it unsecured. The vibrations beneath the steel softened slightly, as if the rig itself acknowledged my compliance. I checked my flashlight and emergency lights, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement, but the area seemed calm, at least momentarily. The Mariana Trench, however, had a way of reminding you that calm was always temporary, and obedience was a fleeting refuge. Moving down the narrow corridor, I noted other hatches along the platform. Each one was a potential gateway for unseen forces, and I reminded myself again of Rule 6 as I passed. The vibrations rolled steadily beneath the steel grates, growing in rhythm when I hesitated too long near any open panel. I resisted the temptation to investigate, focusing instead on the locked hatches, each a barrier between the rig and the trench below. The shadows stretched and shifted, teasing my peripheral vision, but I kept my focus on the steel and the light patterns. Reaching the junction near the secondary service bay, I noticed a hatch that had been left slightly ajar. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized someone else may have ignored Rule 6. I approached cautiously, hand on the rail, feeling the vibrations pulse beneath me like the heartbeat of the Mariana Trench itself. I reached for the latch, ensuring the mechanism engaged fully, double-checking it with my gloved fingers. The shadows shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my action, reinforcing the importance of the rule with every pulse. I continued along the graded walkways, every step deliberate, avoiding distractions and shadows that could lure me toward disobedience. The vibrations beneath my boots persisted, subtle but insistent, almost as if the rig was alive and observing. Each hatch I passed reminded me of Rule 6, a rule that seemed simple on paper but essential in practice. Leaving one unsecured could destabilize the balance between the rig and the forces below, and I felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down with every careful step. Near the outer platforms, the vibration grew stronger, echoing through the beams in long rolling waves. The emergency lights flickered faintly, and I kept my focus on the hatches, checking each to ensure they were properly secured. One hatch in particular stood out. It was slightly warped, the latch loose, as though the vibrations had nudged it over time. I hesitated, recalling that any oversight could invite the trench's unseen presence into the rig. Carefully, I re-engaged the lock, listening for the satisfying click that meant Rule 6 had been obeyed. I glanced down at the abyss beyond the railings, the Mariana Trench, a vast inky void swallowing all light. The vibrations beneath my feet rolled in rhythm, with my racing heartbeat, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between safety and catastrophe. Each hatch I secured felt like a minor victory, an assertion of control over a rig that seemed almost alive. The shadows moved subtly, as though probing the edges of my perception, but I ignored them, focusing on the lesson Rule 6 had drilled into me. Never leave a secured hatch open, no matter how tempting or insignificant it might appear. Returning toward the main platform, I checked every hatch along the inner corridors. The vibrations beneath my boots were now less rhythmic, more uneven, almost like a warning pulse signaling the importance of absolute vigilance. The air felt heavier here, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of the trench's immense pressure and the risks of carelessness. Every shadow seemed exaggerated under the emergency lights, and every misaligned hatch felt like a potential breach. I understood now why Rule 6 existed. One lapse could allow forces I didn't fully comprehend to invade spaces designed to keep them contained. At the generator bay, I paused to review the hatch I had initially checked, ensuring it was still locked tight. The vibrations had settled slightly, but I knew that ignoring Rule 6 even once could have lasting consequences. My flashlight swept across the beams and supports, catching minor shadows that twisted unnaturally. I shivered, aware that the Mariana Trench seemed to observe every action I took, rewarding compliance and punishing disobedience. Each secured hatch was a small defense against the unknown, a fragile barrier that separated the rig from the dark, silent depths below. Finally, I returned to the observation deck, where the outer platform stretched toward the abyss. The emergency lights guided my path as I ensured each hatch along the way was properly secured, obeying Rule 6 with meticulous care. The vibrations beneath the floor plates continued, a subtle reminder of the trench's presence, but the rig felt slightly steadier with every hatch locked. Shadows moved unnaturally at the edges of the lights, but I focused on the steel and the mechanisms, fully understanding that one lapse could have consequences that extended far beyond what any human could survive. The lesson was clear: never leave a secured hatch open after checking it. Obedience here was survival. As I moved back toward the inner corridors, a sudden whisper of sound tickled the edge of my consciousness, and I remembered with dread Rule 7. Never speak or respond to voices coming from the depths. The Mariana Trench had a way of tricking your senses, and the faint, hollow tones seemed almost human, teasing my curiosity and threatening to pull me into a trap. My pulse spiked as I froze in place, straining my ears to determine if the sound was real or a trick of the rig's vibrations. Every fiber in my body screamed at me not to answer, yet instinctively I wanted to speak, to see if the sound would respond to a human voice. The whispering persisted, rising and falling in intensity, like the pulse of the trench itself. Shadows along the steel beams twisted in tandem, stretching unnaturally across the corridor as if they were extensions of the sound. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but the edges of the beam revealed nothing tangible, only fleeting hints of movement just beyond reach. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself that the rule existed because responding would draw attention, and attention from the trench was never safe. I forced my steps forward, keeping my eyes on the blinking emergency lights, resisting the urge to call back. Each step seemed to amplify the voices, faint murmurs that echoed along the walls and under the grates in eerie harmony with the vibrations beneath me. The whispers shifted in tone, almost pleading, coaxing me toward the outer corridors again. My mind raced, imagining voices I recognized, even friends I had worked with long before the rig descended into this nightmare. I fought the impulse to reply, aware that any acknowledgement could tip the balance and invite something unseen closer. The Mariana Trench was patient, and it knew the power of sound over human weakness. I reached the junction near the secondary generator bay, where the corridors twisted and the shadows seemed to gather like smoke. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if guiding me toward the edge of a platform where the abyss pressed against the steel. I gripped the railing tightly, fighting the temptation to answer, remembering the lesson from Torres. Curiosity is the enemy. The voices will test you, but you cannot respond. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I realized that obeying Rule 7 wasn't just about survival, it was about maintaining the fragile barrier between the rig and the unknown. The vibrations beneath the grates pulsed irregularly, as though reacting to the proximity of the voices. I forced my breathing into slow, controlled intervals, trying to ignore the human cadence of the sounds that mimicked conversation. Each whisper seemed to promise safety, companionship, or knowledge, drawing on every memory and emotion I had ever had. I reminded myself sternly that these were tricks, illusions meant to break discipline. Following even one of the whispers could unravel everything the previous rules had protected me from. Moving along the grated walkway, I noticed the shadows lengthening in ways that contradicted the light patterns. The voices followed me, flowing around corners and across beams, bending the space with their intensity. I fought the urge to respond verbally, keeping my lips pressed tight, muttering only to myself internally to maintain my sanity. The emergency lights flickered faintly, offering rhythm and reassurance, and I synchronized my steps with them, refusing to let the whispers dictate my movements. Rule 7 became a mantra in my mind, a constant reminder that acknowledgement was death in disguise. I reached the junction leading to the observation deck, and the whispers intensified, echoing through the narrow corridors and metallic beams. Each voice was distinct yet impossible to identify. It called my name, whispered warnings, and occasionally laughed softly in ways that sounded both human and alien. The vibrations beneath my boots rolled like long waves, aligning subtly with the cadence of the voices. I clenched my flashlight with trembling hands, focusing entirely on the glowing emergency lights, using them as an anchor to avoid being pulled into the trap. Obedience was the only option. On the outer platforms, the darkness of the Mariana Trench pressed in from all sides. The whispers seemed to emerge from the abyss itself, carried on currents that made the steel grates hum in harmony. I resisted the urge to answer, keeping my flashlight low and my steps precise along the path, illuminated by the blinking lights. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, forming shapes that mimicked movement and gestures. I reminded myself constantly, never speak or respond to voices coming from the depths. Obedience here wasn't just about rationality, it was about survival against an intelligence far older and more patient than any human. As I approached the central platform, the whispers swirled around me, soft and persistent, a symphony of temptation. The vibrations beneath my feet became sharper, reacting almost to my thoughts, as though the trench could sense my internal struggle. I kept my focus forward, ignoring each voice that tried to draw me closer to the railings or the outer corridors. The blinking emergency lights provided a rhythm to follow, a beat I could anchor my steps to, while resisting the pull of the abyss. Each ignored whisper reinforced the necessity of Rule 7 and the consequences of disobedience. The observation deck loomed ahead, exposed directly to the dark abyss. The whispers followed me across the grated platforms, sometimes flitting ahead like shadows, sometimes echoing behind like footsteps. I could feel the vibrations synchronize with their pitch, rolling beneath the steel in waves that threatened to unbalance me. My flashlight revealed glimpses of warped shadows along the railings, and I forced my focus to the glowing emergency lights. Every pulse and step reminded me of the critical lesson: responding would be fatal, and the voices were predators disguised in familiarity. I stopped near a junction where the corridor narrowed, taking a moment to steady my breathing. The whispers came in waves, a chorus of human and alien tones that promised safety if only I would answer. I forced myself to take a deep breath and step forward, using the emergency lights as my guide. The vibrations beneath the grates intensified, almost as though testing my resolve. I realized with chilling clarity that Rule 7 was less about the voices themselves and more about the rig's interaction with the trench below. Obedience was the line between control and chaos. Crossing the observation deck, I remained hyper-aware of the whispers following me from every corner. The darkness of the Mariana Trench felt alive, and shadows stretched unnaturally over the beams. I walked carefully, my pulse synchronized with the emergency lights, refusing to allow the voices to influence me. Every whisper became sharper, more insistent, and the vibrations underfoot mirrored their rhythm. I reminded myself internally that never speak or respond to voices coming from the depths wasn't just a rule, it was an absolute law, a barrier between the rig and the unimaginable horrors lurking below. By the time I reached the safer inner corridors, the whispers faded gradually, retreating as if acknowledging my obedience. The vibrations beneath the steel returned to a steady, manageable rhythm. I paused, heart pounding, flashlight beams sweeping across the walls and grates, knowing the Mariana Trench had once again tested me. Rule 7 had been critical in ensuring my survival, a reminder that even the faintest, most human-sounding whisper could mask a deadly intent. The lesson was clear: obedience here wasn't optional, and the abyss never forgave lapses in discipline. I reached the inner walkway, where the pipes hummed softly, still feeling the echoes of the whispers behind me. When I remembered Rule 8, never touch the water when the rig vibrates in a steady rhythm. The vibrations had settled into a subtle pulse beneath the metal, steady and almost hypnotic, making every piece of the rig feel strangely alive. A faint sheen of moisture clung to the grated floor, shimmering as if responding to each rhythmic thrum. I tightened my gloves instinctively, sensing how dangerous the smallest mistake could become down here. The corridor ahead led toward the desalination tanks, a section of the rig known for condensation buildup during pressure shifts. The steady rhythm beneath my boots made each step feel amplified, the metal seeming to flex with the vibrations. I noticed a thin trail of water trickling along the edge of the walkway, moving in slow pulses that matched the hum. The water behaved unnaturally, not flowing but expanding and retracting in perfect sync with the undercurrent. My instincts told me to get past it quickly, but the sight held me for a moment longer than I liked. I knelt carefully to examine the moisture without getting too close, keeping my hands well clear of the pulsing trail. The water responded to the rig's vibrations, as though connected to something deeper below, rising in tiny ripples even without external disturbance. A low unease crept over me as I scanned the walls for leaks, realizing none of the pipes were damaged. The trail shouldn't have been there, and its rhythmic movement suggested the trench's influence. I stood slowly, becoming aware of how fragile the boundary was between the rig and the abyss beneath it. The vibrations intensified slightly as I stepped deeper into the corridor, creating a subtle pressure in the air that made my ears throb. My flashlight beam glided along the walls, revealing drifting patches of condensation that pulsed in time with the floor. Even the droplets clinging to the metal seemed alive, stretching and contracting as if breathing. I felt the presence of something outside the metal, waiting for any sign of contact. The rule existed for a reason, and now I could sense why. The water wasn't just reacting, it was listening. Reaching the intersection near the filtration tanks, I froze as I spotted a large pool of water that shouldn't have been there. It sat perfectly still for a heartbeat, then trembled gently as the rig pulsed beneath me. The ripples didn't spread outward. Instead, they formed shapes that curled toward the walkway like reaching fingers. My breath caught as I realized the water wasn't pooling from the rig. It was rising from the grates. I stepped back slowly, careful not to let my boots touch the moving edge. The rhythmic vibrations beneath me deepened as though reacting to my presence. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting brief shadows across the trembling pool. Each pulse made the water stretch further, as if trying to bridge the gap between itself and me. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the quiet, echoing sensation in my head that felt like the water was probing my thoughts. The trench had ways of sensing contact, and touching the water when the rig vibrated in rhythm meant giving it a direct link. I steadied my breathing, keeping my gaze fixed on the shimmering surface as I slowly edged around the hazard. As I moved along the wall, the water shifted subtly, retracting from one corner and expanding toward another, like an organism adjusting its position. The air grew colder the closer it crept, forming tiny crystals along the steel that glowed faintly in the dim light. My flashlight illuminated thin filaments inside the water, twisting sluggishly with each rhythmic pulse. The realization struck me with a sharp jolt. These movements weren't caused by currents, they were deliberate. I forced myself to look away, reminding myself that distance was my only advantage. The walkway narrowed ahead, forcing me closer to the pulsing trail. My breath misted in the cold air as I measured the remaining space, calculating whether I could cross without contact. The vibrations intensified suddenly, sending a sharp tremor through the grate that caused the water to surge forward. I pressed back against the wall, feeling the cold metal against my spine as the water snaked inches closer. A faint hum resonated through the corridor, not mechanical but instinctive, like a signal meant for something far below. The trench was preparing for something. I evaluated the narrowing gap again, watching how the water paused and then retreated in slow pulses as if assessing my intentions. The vibrations steadied, settling into a slow, relentless rhythm that synchronized with the movement of the water. My pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't stay here. The longer I waited, the more the trench would anticipate my actions. I needed to move fast, but precision mattered even more. One misstep and the water would touch the fabric of my suit, and the consequences of that were unthinkable. With a deep breath, I braced myself and began moving along the wall, keeping my weight centered and my steps deliberate. The water shifted subtly, reacting to each vibration in the grate, its edges trembling like the tips of tendrils. My flashlight beam danced across the rippling surface, revealing faint patterns that resembled symbols or flowing lines. I forced myself not to look too closely, knowing the trench loved to distract with illusions. Each step forward felt like defiance, and the rhythmic hum beneath me grew heavier. Halfway through the narrow section, a sudden surge in the rig's vibration nearly threw me off balance. The grates shuddered violently, and the water leapt upward in a jagged pulse, reaching toward my boots. I pressed myself harder against the wall, sliding sideways as the pool expanded with unnatural speed. My breath hitched as thin streams of water formed twisting shapes, almost like limbs seeking contact. I kept moving, repeating in my mind that touching the water meant surrender. The trench never missed an opportunity once contact was made. I reached the other side just as the water surged again, pulling back into a smooth, controlled pattern as if disappointed. My heart pounded painfully in my chest, and the chill from the corridor clung to my skin beneath the suit. I kept walking, avoiding any remaining moisture patches, until I reached a section of dry grating. Only then did I let myself breathe more deeply, though the vibrations beneath the metal continued their steady rhythm. The rig felt alive, responding to the trench like a body reacting to a heartbeat. The corridor eventually widened, leading to the maintenance lift that would take me back toward the central platform. The vibrations remained steady beneath my feet, but there was no sign of water in this section. The sharp hum of machinery returned, grounding me briefly as I stepped into the lift and triggered the manual controls. My gloves trembled slightly from tension, but I forced my hands steady. The trench had tested me again, probing for weakness, and for now I had passed. But the night was far from over. As the lift ascended, I watched the lower levels disappear into darkness, knowing the water was still pulsing below in perfect rhythm. It wasn't done with me. The vibrations hummed through the lift's metal frame, reminding me that contact would mean more than physical danger. It would mean connection, and the trench wanted connection more than anything. I gripped the railing tightly as the lift slowed, preparing myself for whatever waited above. Following the rule had saved me, but only for now. After exiting the lift and returning to the main platform, a lingering chill reminded me of Rule 9. Never enter the submerged maintenance tunnels alone. The tunnels beneath the rig were partially flooded from years of deep-sea pressure and constant humidity, creating a labyrinth of narrow corridors where light barely reached. I recalled the first time I had attempted the lower tunnels alone, and how quickly isolation had escalated into fear that gnawed at every nerve. Even a few steps without another person nearby made the water seem sentient, reflecting shapes that weren't really there, or perhaps were. The corridor leading to the submerged tunnels smelled faintly of salt and rust, and condensation clung to the walls in delicate rivulets. Each step forward made the graded walkway shiver slightly beneath my boots, syncing with the persistent vibrations from the rig. Shadows flickered in the corners of my eyes, shaped by the dim emergency lights, reminding me that even the tiniest movement could mask something lurking just out of sight. I gripped my flashlight tightly, remembering the rule's purpose. The tunnels magnified danger, and being alone removed any chance of immediate aid. I paused at the junction where the maintenance hatches opened to the waterlogged sections, hesitant to step into the narrow passage. The water pooled slightly on the floor, its surface still except for occasional ripples caused by the rig's subtle vibrations. I reminded myself that Rule 9 existed for a reason. Previous incidents had shown that anyone alone could vanish without a trace if the tunnels shifted or the water responded unexpectedly. My reflection in the water seemed distorted, almost as if the abyss below was stretching the image of myself into something alien and unrecognizable. Taking careful steps, I entered the first tunnel, the walls closing in tightly on either side. My flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating puddles and submerged pipes that rose from the floor like skeletal fingers. Every vibration beneath my boots made the metal floor plates resonate ominously, and I felt the water pulse subtly in response, as though aware of my presence. The corridor stretched forward endlessly, forcing me to keep my pace steady and my mind sharp. The Mariana Trench had a way of amplifying isolation, and I felt it pressing down, testing my courage with every inch I moved. I noticed small bubbles rising from hidden cracks in the submerged floor, moving toward the surface in rhythmic bursts that mirrored the rig's vibrations. I stopped, recalling that even minimal disturbances could trigger reactions in the water, and the tunnels themselves could become traps. Shadows shifted along the walls, elongated by the flashlight, and my imagination teetered on the edge of reality, warning me of figures that weren't really there. I reminded myself of Rule 9 internally, never alone, because the tunnels magnified everything, turning tiny risks into life-threatening dangers. As I progressed deeper, the tunnel narrowed further, and the water level rose slightly, covering the metal grating beneath my boots. I could feel the cold seeping through the soles of my suit, chilling me from the inside out. The vibrations continued, subtle but insistent, causing faint ripples in the water that stretched like thin fingers toward me. I forced myself to focus on the light and the path, refusing to imagine what might lurk below the surface. Rule 9 was no longer abstract. It was survival, a barrier between life and being swallowed by the abyss. The flashlight illuminated a rusted valve partially submerged, a reminder of human presence long before my shift. Its edges were slick, glinting faintly as I passed, and the water seemed to move differently around it, hinting at the trench's awareness of my body and intentions. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to maintain steady steps, feeling the echoes of the vibrations run up my legs. The tunnels felt alive, every movement I made magnified and monitored, making me painfully aware of the importance of not venturing alone. Rule 9 was a shield, fragile but essential. A narrow bend approached, where the ceiling lowered sharply and the water pooled deeper, forming a small silent reservoir. My flashlight reflected off the surface, casting shapes that seemed to move independently of the currents. I reminded myself silently that entering this alone would be a mistake if any disturbance occurred. The vibrations beneath me synchronized with the water's subtle rhythm, creating a hypnotic effect that threatened to slow my reactions. I gritted my teeth, moving deliberately, and kept reminding myself, never alone, because the Mariana Trench had eyes in places unseen. Halfway through the submerged section, I noticed faint imprints in the muck beneath the water. They were irregular, partially erased by the tide of vibrations, but they suggested movement from something other than me. My pulse quickened as I stepped carefully around them, flashlight shaking slightly in my gloved hands. The shadows cast by the beam seemed to curl and stretch, forming shapes reminiscent of human limbs, yet elongated and unnatural. Rule 9 echoed in my mind. Solitude in these tunnels invited the abyss, and I could feel its awareness testing my will with every heartbeat. I reached a partially flooded maintenance hatch that provided access to a secondary shaft. The water rippled in perfect rhythm with the floor beneath, and I realized that even breathing too loudly might betray my presence. Shadows seemed to coalesce at the edges of the light, suggesting forms just out of reach. I forced myself to focus, pressing against the wall and avoiding unnecessary contact with the water. Rule 9 had become a lifeline. Ignoring it could mean never returning, vanishing into the submerged corridors of the rig where no one could reach. A sudden pulse in the vibrations made the water surge slightly, nudging me toward the wall. I felt a cold prickle along my spine as the subtle waves lapped at my boots, almost testing my balance and resolve. The tunnel ahead narrowed again, forcing me to navigate carefully along the slick metal and submerged grating. I reminded myself repeatedly that entering alone was forbidden, that every meter without a companion was a gamble with the trench itself. The darkness pressed in, the vibrations hummed, and the water seemed almost alive, moving with a purpose I could not understand. Finally, I emerged from the submerged tunnel into a slightly drier maintenance bay, the water receding and the vibrations calming just enough for me to regain composure. Shadows still lingered along the edges, and the pulse beneath the floor reminded me that the abyss was patient, always watching. I paused, letting the flashlight sweep across the flooded paths I had just crossed, understanding the full magnitude of Rule 9. I had survived the solo passage, but the lesson was crystal clear. Entering the submerged tunnels alone was an invitation for the trench to reach out, and only obedience kept me from vanishing. The first time I heard my name spoken in the dark throat of the Mariana Trench, I thought it was just calm interference, but Rule 10 never answered the voice. If it knows your name flashed through my mind like a warning burned into my skull. Down here, nothing should know who you are. Nothing should be able to pronounce your name perfectly through water thick enough to crush submarines. I'd heard other workers talk about it in whispers, but I never believed them until I heard my own voice calling for me, asking me to come help. That was when everything changed. The way it spoke felt wrong, like someone had recorded me and slowed the tape until it dripped. But worse than that was the tone. Patient, gentle, familiar. I held my breath and didn't respond. Every instinct screamed to answer, because it sounded like I was in trouble. But answering is how it hooks you, how it learns the rhythm of your breath, the pattern of your thinking. They tell us the voice listens for hesitation. It waits for weakness, and when you respond, even with a single word, you give it permission to come closer. I stayed silent, but silence isn't easy to maintain when the trench itself seems to press its ear against you. The voice didn't stop. It called again, this time more urgently, like I was drowning somewhere behind the platform. I knew it was mimicking distress. They do that. The things in the abyss. They mimic what you'll respond to. Some guys hear their mother, some hear a missing crewman, but hearing myself, that nearly broke me. My hands shook so badly that I dropped the wrench I was carrying. The sound echoed unnaturally far, like the trench repeated it, Back inside the maintenance pod, the comm panel kept lighting up. The same voice, the same fake panic. Please, please help me. But the pitch was slightly off on each call, like it was adjusting itself, practicing me. That made it worse. Something was trying to be me. I didn't dare unplug the comm. Protocol says that breaks the pod's monitoring system. So I had to sit there, listening to myself, beg for my own help while I forced myself to breathe slowly and not answer. They say the voice hates being ignored. They say it gets impatient. It proved true. The voice eventually stopped pretending to be distressed. It repeated my name in a whisper so low it felt like it slid beneath my skin. Then it asked me a question only I knew the answer to. Something from my childhood, something no creature in the trench should ever know. And that's when I realized it wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was digging, reaching, probing memories, like something brushing fingers over old scars. I pressed my hands to my head and shut my eyes, whispering the rule to myself over and over. Silence followed, a silence so heavy I almost wished the voice returned, because at least then I'd know where the danger was. Instead, the pod creaked, the pressure monitor flickered, and something scraped the outer hull, slow, deliberate, like fingernails made of stone or bone. The whole structure groaned as if something was testing its weight, or testing me. My breath quickened despite myself. The thing outside sensed it. A soft tapping echoed from the window, like a knuckle trying to get my attention. But I didn't move. Movement counts as answering too. I sat frozen for minutes, maybe hours. The tapping traveled across the glass, then down the metal frame. Then it stopped directly below me. Through the floor I felt a vibration like a pulse. Not mine, not human. The voice returned one last time, calmer, softer, confident. I know you hear me. Not help me, not come quick, not the mimicry. It was speaking in its own voice now, something layered and ancient, something that didn't need to pretend anymore. That was when I truly understood Rule 10. If it knows your name, it already knows enough to find you. Eventually, the scraping stopped. The comm went silent. The pressure readings normalized like nothing had happened. But after I returned topside, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the audio logs for that shift, logs that automatically record every transmission, there was no trace of the voice, not even static. Nothing had spoken through the comm, nothing had tapped the window. According to the system, the pod had been silent the entire time, which means whatever spoke to me wasn't using the equipment. It was speaking directly to me. I didn't sleep for days after that. I kept hearing my name whispered from the corners of my bunk. Sometimes the voice sounded like me, sometimes like a stranger, sometimes like something caught between. The psychologist told me it was stress-induced auditory hallucination, but the technician who checked my pod pulled me aside when nobody was around. He whispered that faint scratch marks were found inside the outer viewing glass on the pressure side, where nothing human could reach. He told me not to ask questions I didn't want answers to. Now whenever I descend, the darkness feels like it's waiting, like it remembers me. The others say, once the voice learns your name, you never really stop hearing it. You just learn to pretend you don't. I try. God knows, I try. But every time the lights flicker, or the sonar pings too slowly, I feel my throat tighten. Because I know that if I ever respond, even accidentally, it will come back. Not as a whisper, not as a scratch on the glass, but face to face, rising from the trench with my own voice, my own shape, my own name. If you're ever down here and you hear something that sounds like you, or someone you love, or someone who shouldn't be here, whatever you do not answer. By the time I reached the outer observation platform, I remembered Rule 11. Never look into the abyss when the vibrations stop, and a knot of dread tightened in my chest. The Mariana Trench stretched endlessly below, blacker than any night sky, and the metal beneath my boots felt heavier than usual. All around me, the rig's vibrations had ceased. The steady hum that had accompanied every movement, every step, every heartbeat, had vanished. That silence was worse than any sound. It was deliberate, patient, and alive. I stayed frozen at the railing, peering into the inky void without moving my head, knowing that the moment I allowed my eyes to follow the darkness, the abyss would respond. My mind screamed warnings, reminders of every story, every caution from those who'd come before me. Never look down, they had said. Never even think about it when the rig stops moving. But curiosity clawed at me. I wanted to see what waited, to measure what it meant for the trench to be still, to feel what it was hiding beneath the weight of the water and pressure. The platform felt unreal without the vibrations, like standing on a structure disconnected from physics itself. I shifted slightly, careful not to make a sound, and tried to focus on the small lights blinking on the rig's surface. They looked insignificant against the black abyss below, but they were a tether to reality, a reminder that I was still alive. Still, my eyes kept drifting toward the trench. A part of me wanted to know if the abyss was empty, if obeying the rule had truly protected me, or if it was merely waiting, patient and eternal, for me to falter. I took a cautious step back, forcing myself to look at the platform instead of down into the water. Shadows twisted along the beams in impossible ways, seemingly independent of any light source. My heart thudded in rhythm with the briefest flicker of lights, and I sensed the emptiness below pressing upward. I realized the rule wasn't just about seeing, it was about acknowledging something that should remain unknown. Looking was an invitation, a breach of contract, and the abyss had a memory for breaches. Each pulse of fear echoed louder than the vibrations that had vanished. The wind from above stirred faintly, though the Mariana Trench's depths shouldn't allow it. Tiny droplets from condensation clung to the railings, glistening like pins of light. I forced myself to focus on them, on the textures and surfaces that were tangible, that responded logically to my touch. But the abyss called silently, a magnetic pull stronger than gravity, more insistent than logic. I remembered Rule 11 again, mentally repeating the phrase, trying to convince myself that not looking was enough. But the stopping of vibrations had a presence, almost sentient, watching to see if I could obey one final time. I edged along the platform toward the maintenance access that led back to the inner corridors. The silence was overwhelming, oppressive, like an ocean of stillness pressing against every metal joint of the rig. My flashlight beam illuminated the narrow path, but its light seemed inadequate against the vast nothingness. I had the distinct impression that the abyss could see me just as clearly, that it had waited, paused, studied my hesitation. Rule 11 had always seemed the simplest, don't look, but now I understood it was about preserving the mind as much as the body. Pausing near a junction where shadows gathered, I sensed a subtle shift beneath the platform, not vibrations, but a movement of pressure, like a slow inhale from the water itself. I held my breath, resisting the urge to lean over and check. The darkness below seemed to thicken, condensing into something almost tangible. I realized with absolute certainty that the abyss was aware of my presence, aware of the rule, and aware that I could choose to break it. My pulse raced as my eyes fought the magnetic pull, dragging me toward the infinite black. I thought about every previous rule, every step I'd taken to survive. Each one had been tested by the trench, and each one had nearly undone me. Now, with the vibrations completely absent, Rule 11 presented the ultimate test. I could feel the rhythmless pressure pushing against me, stretching into the corners of my mind. It whispered through memory, through instinct, urging me to glance down. I forced myself to focus on the platform's steel, every rivet, every bolt. Still, my peripheral vision betrayed me, offering glimpses of impossible shapes just below the surface. A low shiver ran up my spine as I realized the abyss had grown patient beyond comprehension. The water was still, perfectly still, but I sensed it moving beneath the appearance of stagnancy. Each ripple that wasn't there seemed louder than the vibrations that had pulsed for hours. The darkness held secrets that the light couldn't penetrate, secrets that I had been spared until now. The longer I lingered, the more the abyss seemed to expect something from me: compliance, curiosity, or a glance into its void. I tightened my grip on the railing, willing myself to obey. As I moved slowly back toward the inner platform, the pressure beneath the metal shifted once more, a subtle, almost imperceptible roll like something brushing against the base of the rig. My heartbeat sounded impossibly loud in my ears, filling the silence that had replaced the vibrations. Shadows flickered and twisted along the beams, as if stretching toward the darkness. I thought about retreating entirely to the top deck, away from the abyss, but even there the rule applied. Rule 11 wasn't just a physical guideline, it was a commandment of survival in a place where the ocean could watch, wait, and remember. Every step along the narrow walkway was deliberate. I avoided looking at the abyss, forcing myself to follow the illuminated path, but my mind betrayed me, constructing shapes in the darkness, imagining forms just beyond comprehension. The silence below felt like the slow breathing of something enormous, patient, aware of every hesitation. Rule 11 repeated silently in my head, anchored me only partially. The trench was teaching me that obedience could protect the body, but curiosity, or even awareness, was a different hazard entirely. I could survive the abyss physically, but the mind remained vulnerable. By the time I reached the safer corridors that led to the main platform, the stillness below had begun to feel oppressive, almost intelligent. I could no longer distinguish between the vibrations of the rig and the silent pulse of the trench itself. My flashlight illuminated the familiar metallic walls, but I sensed the abyss watching me, waiting, almost calculating. Rule 11 had been obeyed, but compliance didn't guarantee safety. It only guaranteed delay. The trench was patient, and I had learned over 10 rules that patience often surpassed human understanding. I paused at the junction leading back to the control room, glancing once more at the void without looking. Even from this distance, I could feel the abyss pressing against every surface, as though it could perceive me through intention alone. My fingers clutched the railing tighter, my jaw tense. I understood that the absence of vibration was a lure, a test more than anything else. The abyss wanted acknowledgement, but I refused to give it. Still, something in that blackness knew my name, my routines, my fears, and it was waiting for me to falter. As I finally stepped back onto the central platform, the shadows of the rig stretched into the darkness below, reminding me that the abyss was more than just water and pressure. Rule 11 had been obeyed, and yet I felt no relief. A part of me wished the vibrations would return, giving structure to reality, but the silence lingered, almost as if it could measure the depth of my fear. I realized that the trench was patient beyond imagination, and even a single glance into its void could erase years of knowledge and experience. The observation deck seemed safer now, bathed in emergency lights and human engineering, but the abyss remained, a perfect black mirror beneath me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the shaking in my hands, and reminded myself that the last rule was the hardest, not because it was dangerous physically, but because it demanded absolute restraint of the mind. To look was to acknowledge something no human was meant to face, and yet deep inside, a whisper of curiosity clawed at the edges of my consciousness, promising glimpses I was warned to never see. And I knew as I stood there, that the abyss was waiting for that one moment when I might just turn my eyes. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.